I was thinking about this the other day. Now, most organizations value experience really highly in their leaders, and that makes sense. You want people who've seen things before and who've handled pressure and understand how situations, well, how they tend to play out. And over time, that experience gives you a kind of confidence in how the organization behaves. You start to get a feel for it, what's normal and what isn't, and what might need some attention and what will probably resolve itself. But I think there's something else that comes with that. And I think it's something that we don't really talk about very often. The more familiar a system becomes, well, the easier it is to assume that you're seeing it clearly, even when things are starting to change. And the tricky part is, it doesn't feel like you're missing anything when you're in that moment. It feels like everything is still, well, more or less how it always has been. We talk about experience in leadership as if it's the thing that we're aiming for. And in many ways, it is. People are promoted because they've seen situations before and they've handled pressure and they've developed that judgment over time. There's this quiet confidence that comes with that. You don't need to analyze everything from scratch because you recognize the patterns. But alongside that, something else, something really interesting is happening. And it's easy to miss if you've never really sat back and thought about it. The more familiar a system becomes, well, the less you consciously notice how it's behaving. And it's not because you've stopped paying attention, but because your brain has just got really good at filling in the gaps. It's a bit like when you walk into your own home in the evening. It's lovely to be there, but you don't really see it in the detail anymore. You just move through it. And if something small changes, like a light bulb dimming slightly over a few weeks, well, you don't really clock it straight away. It still feels like the same room. And it's only when maybe that light goes or someone else points out that it's not as bright as it was that you realize, well, actually, it's been changing for a while. And organizations can feel exactly like that when you've been around them for a long time. You start to develop a sense of how things usually play out. You know where pressure tends to build, which issues tend to resolve themselves, and what normal looks like, even when things are a little bit stretched. And that familiarity is incredibly useful. It's what allows leaders to operate in complex environments without getting necessarily overwhelmed. But it also means that when the system starts to change very gradually, it can be surprisingly difficult to spot because your interpretation of what's happening is being shaped quietly and constantly by what you've seen before. Now, there's a piece of neuroscience behind this that I always find a little bit helpful. The brain isn't just observing the world as it is, it's continuously predicting what it expects to see. And then it compares reality against prediction. And most of the time, that does make us incredibly efficient. We don't have to process every detail from scratch. But it also means that if something shifts slowly and in very small increments, well, the brain tends to just smooth it out. It looks close enough to what we expect, so it doesn't trigger a strong reaction. And if you think about experienced leaders, they have very well developed expectations. They've seen systems under pressure. They've watched things go wrong and then recover. Over time, that builds a sense that the organization is understandable, even when it is complex. So when something starts to feel slightly off, the instinct is often to interpret it through that existing understanding because it feels familiar enough to be manageable. And that's where confidence and blind spots can start to overlap, and not in an obvious way. as we've said, it's not about anyone dismissing risk. It's more about the risk, whether it's being understood through a lens that in the past has worked reliably. And you see this pattern when you look back at major failures. There wasn't dramatic and chaotic decision making, but capable people working within systems that they believed and they understood. So let's think about the Boeing 737 MAX situation. There were technical changes introduced to the aircraft. And alongside that, a set of assumptions about how the system would behave and how the pilots would respond. So on the surface, everything was being managed within a familiar framework. The organization had designed, they had built, and they had delivered aircraft successfully for decades. And that history shaped confidence. But underneath that, well, the system had shifted in ways that weren't fully visible through that lens of previous experience. And that's where this becomes a little bit challenging, because risk in organization rarely arrives in a way that forces you to stop and take notice. It tends to develop quietly. A workaround that was meant to be temporary becomes a part of how things are done. A small delay, well, that just becomes expected, and pressure builds. But it's building in increments that feels manageable at each step. So the system is adapting, the team are compensating. And because everything is still functioning, well, it reinforces the sense that things are under control. And you can see this play out in really ordinary ways within organizations. You might have a team that is constantly hitting deadlines, and from the outside, everything looks fine. Their outputs are there, the clients are being served, and nothing is obviously breaking. But if you were to sit with that team for a while, well, then you might start to hear a slightly different story. You might hear that people are staying a little bit later than they used to. The small checks are being skipped because, well, we know this job. Someone might build a quick workaround and it's to get something done and over the line, and it works. And then that workaround gets used over and over again. So no single moment feels like a problem. In fact, if you asked most people in that environment, they'd probably say things, yeah, they're busy, but manageable. Because, yeah, they're manageable. Right up until the point they're not. And what's happening there isn't failure. Well, it's adaptation. The system is stretching to cope with pressure, and experienced people are making it work, which is exactly what you would want them to do. But at the same time, well, that adaptation can quietly mask much of the underlying conditions that have changed. It's a bit like when your phone battery starts degrading. First, it lasts all day until it doesn't. And for a while, you just adjust without really thinking about it. You might put it on charge a bit early. You might start carrying a charger or a battery pack. But you don't necessarily stop and say, something fundamental has changed here. You just adapt to this new normal. All the while, though, the margin for error, well, that's narrowing. But nothing has happened yet to make that visible. So the question isn't really whether experience is valuable, because, well, it absolutely is. Organizations depend on it. The question is really what sits alongside it. And what I've noticed in strong leaders is a kind of deliberate curiosity, not in a dramatic or performative way, but in the way they keep gently testing their own assumptions. They don't just rely on what they already know. They stay interested in what might be changing. They're the ones who pause and wonders whether something feels slightly different, even if they can't immediately explain why. And often they will create space for voices that see the system differently. Maybe people who are closer to the day-to-day work, or Maybe they're newer to the organization, people that are just not as shaped by its history. Because those perspectives can be surprisingly powerful. And not because they're more informed, but because they're less filtered. They're not filling in the gaps in the same way. So they notice other things that other people in the organization might unintentionally overlook. And I think that's where experience really comes into its own when it's paired with a little bit of humility. The recognition that even if something feels familiar, well, it doesn't mean that it's unchanged. That the system you understand well today might not be behaving in quite the same way as it did before. And if you hold on to that, even lightly, it changes how you see things. You become just a little bit more open to the possibility that something is shifting at the edges. Because in complex organizations, that's usually where the most important signals are. Not in those obvious problems that demand attention, but in the small and the gradual changes that sit just beyond what experience expects to notice. And the leaders who tend to catch those early, well, they're not the ones with less experience. They're usually the ones who stay just curious enough to keep looking.